everybody. First and foremost, if you're joining us tonight and you would like to listen to this panel in Spanish, you can click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. That will switch it over from English to Spanish for this evening. My name is Dr. Kathleen Van Voorhis, and I work with the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado. I have the pleasure this evening of moderating a conversation on both homelessness in Denver, as well as the safe outdoor space concept. It is very clear that Denver is seeing the detrimental effects of COVID within our community. And with so many struggling to find work or maintain housing, we have seen an increase of unhoused neighbors throughout all of our neighborhoods. Before I introduce our presenters, there are a few things I would like you to know. The fallout from COVID-19 has exacerbated issues with homelessness in communities across Colorado. Pointed research from Columbia University stated that we would see a 40 to 45% rise in homelessness due to COVID-19. It is also important to note that the University of Pennsylvania found that homelessness leads to a twice as likely hospitalization rate for COVID-19, 4 times as likely for those who are homeless to need critical care, and 3 times more likely for those who are homeless to die of this pandemic. As a response to the research, as well as guidelines issued for COVID, safe outdoor spaces have been created or expanded in cities across Colorado. Some of these cities include Grand Junction, Glenwood Springs, Pickens County, Boulder, and Durango. Tonight, we would like to discuss with you the reality of COVID on homelessness in Denver. We would like to discuss the need for resources and supportive programs such as the SOS, as well as the success of other trauma-informed, housing-first, resource-rich models. I would like to introduce our speakers for this evening. Cuica Montoya is with the Colorado Village Collaborative and will be the Safe Outdoor Space Manager. Chris Connor is joining us from Host and will speak to us about the need throughout Denver, as well as the lack of options for those who are currently struggling with homelessness during COVID. Nicole Martinez is the Executive Director of Camp Hope in Las Cruces and will be offering her expertise on a resource-rich and housing-first encampment model. Dr. Sarah Rowan, as well as Dr. Sarah Stella, are both here to speak with us about their experience working with our unhoused neighbors during COVID, what they've seen, as well as why the SOS model is necessary for our community. Finally, we have the honor of having Reverend Peters from Belong Church join us tonight to discuss what he is seeing throughout his community. And he's also here to discuss an opportunity being made available to all community members within Denver to see an unoccupied model of the SOS. If you have questions during this discussion, we ask that you please put them in the chat box so that we can see them and answer them once our panelists are finished. We understand that this topic is a difficult one to discuss, and we ask all community members to be respectful in their comments, their questions, and their reactions to one another so that we can all use this time as an educational opportunity. With that, I will hand it over to Cuica Montoya.
Hi, thank you so much for hosting this, Kathleen. Appreciate it. So what I'm going to do is just present to you the model that we've designed for safe outdoor space here in Denver. A lot of you may ask, what exactly is a safe outdoor space? So it is a temporary public health response to mitigate the spread of COVID. The CDC guidelines have told us that sweeping encampment models puts folks at risk to contracting COVID and also pushes encampments farther and deeper into neighborhoods. Our safe outdoor space will house 50 tents with 24-hour staffing and management. And we plan for it to be a resource-rich, service-rich environment. Folks that currently sleep outside have very little access to resources like bathrooms, hand sinks, drinking water, hand washing stations. So we want to provide all of those resources here in the environment. We also plan on having outreach services with service providers that have gladly partnered with us to provide outreach services, housing navigation, employment navigation. We'll also be, the on-site management will also be conducting daily wellness screenings, COVID symptom checks, and access to COVID testing access. We have a wonderful partnership with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless and their COVID testing response. St. Francis Center has partnered with us to provide peer navigation and outreach services. And we will also have Harm Reduction Action Center providing outreach services, and Mental Health Center of Denver. So we have really a lot of people. This is a community-led partnership. So what is the purpose of Safe Outdoor Space? Well, I mentioned one, it's mitigating the spread of COVID amongst our unhoused neighbors. We also want to extend equitable access to resources like hotels and ongoing case management. Whoops, I just zoomed through some slides. Technology. You know, once folks access shelter systems, they get those connections. And so what we want to do is, since there's not an alternative other than the shelter system, we want to provide folks with that same connection and access to those resources. What are our racial and ethnic backgrounds of those who would be served by an SOS? So there have been point in time numbers that say that 40% of our unhoused neighbors are people of color. And so we want to make sure that we are addressing this disproportionate amount of folks who are sleeping outside who are people of color. So what criteria is being considered on these evaluation of sites? You know, these are the questions that we get a lot from communities when we start engagement. But what we're looking for is what is the racial breakdown of neighbors and those being served? We want to make sure that we're evaluating what kind of neighborhood impact would happen within the safe outdoor space. We have to consider flooding and environmental concerns. You know, we've eliminated quite a few sites due to FEMA floodplains. But we also need access to utilities. And so fire needs to have access. We need to have water, electricity. And then there are a lot of regulatory issues. What we've found is that there's an old zoning code in Denver, former Chapter 59. I know that folks have been working really hard to try to eliminate that as a barrier, and that's being heard in City Council on October 12th. And we also need to make sure that the sites are accessible for the folks that are going to be residents there. They need to be able to access their jobs, access any current services that they're connected with. And then we need to make sure we have some coverage from the elements. And also, you know, we would provide a fence around the site, which would include privacy netting. And we also need to have a willing landowner and the site be little to no cost. Have other cities utilized this model during COVID? Absolutely. We have some great models that are going on around the city. Portland, Tampa, San Francisco, they just opened one in Aspen. And then we have the lovely Nicole Martinez from Camp Hope in Las Cruces, New Mexico, that has been successfully running a model very similar to this for the last 10 years. So we're working on bringing evidence-based practices to this model. And then I'm going to be managing it, and so along with my colleague Hannah, and you know, we are trauma-informed trained, trained in conflict resolution, de-escalation skills, which kind of leads into how will this SOS site be managed. So we worked really hard on developing this operation plan. We want to make sure that there are folks that are trained, program staff on site 24 hours per day. We reached out to people experiencing homelessness about what they would like to see. And, you know, we heard a lot that police interactions and security interactions are not high on their want list. So we have designed the model to be set staffed 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. We're going to have tons of outreach workers coming in for voluntary access to those services and connections with those folks, mental health services. And then we'll also have guidelines. We plan on having each resident sign a use agreement that basically adheres to community agreements, no guests, no pets, quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. We're looking at, really being respectful to the community that we're in. We also have, we will contract, weekly trash removal, plus the toilet pumping for portable restrooms. And then we have COVID guidelines that are recommended, CDC recommended sanitation upkeep every 2 hours and after every use. And that will also enlist the residents to participate in the upkeep of the site as well. We don't think that it's going to be a perfect place and that sometimes conflicts arise. So all of our staff will be trained in conflict resolution and communicating for calm. We also have restorative accountability processes that will be led by myself and the other SOS manager. And then what are the guidelines? So what is in the use agreement that we will have each resident sign? We want them to be symptom checked, complete an intake form with a manager that coincides with the homeless management information system, and really discuss what are their plans and how can we help them get there and what kind of resources they might need. We also have, basic guidelines like no violence, no weapons, no substances, no trading or selling substances on site, no theft, no fires, no guests due to COVID. We really see this site as a well person's camp, and we'll be really focused on making sure that everybody's healthy. And then, respectful things like quiet hours, and we don't want any discriminatory or oppressive behavior. So it's going to be a community that supports folks to find what's next for them. And yeah, that's my presentation, and I look forward to any questions that you may have. Please put them in the box.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kwika. So Chris, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and just talk a little bit about what you do, as well as what you've seen with COVID. What has the change been, and really what is the need?
Thanks first of all for inviting me to be part of the group here and inviting me to come in alongside some tremendous work being done by the community represented here. Thanks to the folks out there for joining as well. My name's Chris Connor. I'm formerly a street outreach worker from Urban Peak, worked the night shift, engaging young people living at the street level of homelessness, from that level, being as resourceful as I could from them at the curbside. I really cultivated appreciation for harm reduction strategies at that time, which eventually led to an invitation to join the city in the Denver's Road Home program, and administered that for a while before directing it for a couple of years, and now being within the Office of Housing Stability to direct homelessness response. In terms of what we're seeing, I thought I'd bring to the conversation tonight a little bit of numbers that may speak to what neighbors' experiences are. Certainly, our eyes don't deceive us on an increase in homelessness in Denver. That's not uncharacteristic of other major cities across the United States at this time. It's not something that's even necessarily unique to Denver. But I want to take you back to right before the pandemic started, when we do our annual point in time count. A point in time count reports to Washington kind of what the pulse is on homelessness experiences in communities. We do it once a year. Some cities do it only once every couple of years, as Washington requires, and it's done every January in the dead of winter. So going back to January of 2020, we saw that increase, and we saw it before COVID as well. It's harder to put a finer point on what that increase looks like as the year progresses, but we know anecdotally, we know from what we're seeing in our communities that there's an increase there. At the time in January, it was a 6% increase in total experiences of homelessness compared to the year previous. But the really dramatic thing that happened in January 2019 is we saw a dramatic increase in unsheltered homelessness, 80% increase. Because this method only happens once a day in a year, there's a lot of noise that comes in and out of year-to-year point in time counts. In Colorado specifically, it could be 12 degrees one year and it can be 60 degrees the next year. And that certainly impacts the inflows and outflows of homelessness on our streets. But that 80% unsheltered count, a total of 996 at the time, really caught us off guard at that time and seemed to amplify as the year progressed, as COVID hit. And then COVID hit and really disrupted much of our system, much of our network. Our shelter system wasn't designed for a pandemic that required people to stay in one place and to be at least 6 feet away from each other at all times. So our providers were forced into making some really hard decisions. Some of them cut numbers, and they were getting to a threshold where they may have needed to consider shutting down facilities. And that's where you saw us kind of economizing those resources, bringing all those providers together. And I'm sure many folks in Denver are familiar that we stood up the National Western Center and the Coliseum as locations where there were big spaces could provide for the demand at one site. Another part that folks may not be as familiar with is we introduced a motel program in partnership with federal funds that were coming into communities at the time to enable this. That program focused on identifying people who were carrying COVID and placing them into motel for the duration that they were carrying the condition and might be contagious for it, as well as identifying people who may be predisposed for underlying health conditions for morbidity or negative outcomes if they were carrying COVID. That would be known as protective action. The protective action stays are long-term motel stays. And there are people that we have had in motels since the beginning of that program consistently to date today. And in fact, looking at our numbers of where we're at right now, last night we brought 1,683 souls in at night. A very large number, bigger than the city of Nederland, for instance. About half of those folks who are coming in at night for that emergency service are within a hotel room right now. But it's been a year of contradictions, I'd say, in terms of what we see. While we've never been more successful at our ability to bring people inside, we've also never been more challenged on the number of people that we're seeing in large encampments, encamped areas and communities that are remaining outside. Our tools for reaching folks right now in those encampments are limited to outreach engagements, limited to first responder engagements through DPD or the STAR program currently, and limited to those aspects amid the disruptions of needing to also balance for the public health needs that are consistently identified as camps get uprooted and dispersed. Where we see a safe outdoor space model is having an appropriate fit is where can we stabilize some of those individuals who are not coming indoors. We will always pursue indoor options for folks, but one thing to remember is that we build our shelter capacities and our motel resource capacities, we're building to the usage of shelter. We're not building to the total number of people experiencing homelessness in Denver, because if I were to do that, I'd be running entire facilities of empty beds where there aren't folks, because I'd be building to the point in time number is our best estimate of 4,171 beds available when our usage rate is at 1,683 for motel rooms and shelters combined. But we'll always monitor and build to meet the demand of folks who are needing to come inside. If someone says, I'm looking for a place to stay. We'll do everything that we can to make sure that that place exists. So safe outdoor space isn't necessarily a stand-in for that capacity that we're looking for, but it is a way to approach folks from a harm reduction standpoint and from a public health standpoint to protect them in the COVID pandemic environment. And that's what we're mainly, our interest and objective is to how do we identify those folks who, for a number of reasons, may not be optioning shelter for them or may not be able to access the shelter. What kind of product or what kind of experience can we provide them to stabilize them in a place? And what we've heard is that safe outdoor space would work for a lot of those folks.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I'd like to reiterate real quick that with the safe outdoor space, we are trying to fill that gap that Chris just talked about. So we do have a number of unhoused neighbors who will not go inside for a multitude of reasons, some including trauma, the mental health factors, some including the fact that the resources available, you're not allowed to go in as a couple, or you cannot take your pet in with you. So there's different reasons that people cannot go inside, including a significant fear of COVID in a congregate shelter. So that is when we started to talk about the safe outdoor space, which, as Kwika noted, is something that has been picked up around the nation as we look at addressing increased homelessness throughout COVID. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stella as well as Dr. Rowan. Dr. Stella, if you could first just sort of discuss your work with the homeless and sort of what you're seeing, that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Kathleen. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Sarah Stella, and I have actually been working with Chris and others, many others, on a task force to kind of coordinate the response to COVID-19 and people experiencing homelessness. And so early on in the pandemic, we were, very, very concerned about this community and the number of vulnerable people that we have with underlying health conditions. So people that are experiencing homelessness are at high risk for both contracting COVID-19 as well as for developing severe illness from COVID-19. And so we know that because of lack of access to distancing, a home to isolate in, a safe place to be, because of lack of access to hygiene items and things, and also health literacy, that puts people at higher risk for contracting COVID, and that and especially, particularly in congregate settings such as shelters, and also to some degree anywhere there's crowding. And then we know that our population in Denver is exceptionally vulnerable in terms of these underlying health conditions with people with heart disease and lung disease and people that are immunocompromised, and they're at very high risk. And early in the pandemic, we were starting to see numbers, incidents suggesting that our homeless community was disproportionately affected, perhaps more than any other community or neighborhood in Denver at the time. And so we knew that we had to act very quickly with a variety of stakeholders across the city to coordinate the response. And so we actually set up a task force, including folks from the city, Chris and others from Host, folks from our shelter leadership, people doing street outreach, people from hospitals and our local public health agencies, working together to really look at what are the needs, what do we need to do quickly to address this with the goals of preventing or decreasing transmission in this community, and then also preserving our hospital capacity, because we know that when people are, particularly people that are unsheltered, are destabilized and have no place to be, they wind up in our hospitals and our emergency departments. And so really we wanted to look at how do we both prevent transmission and prevent poor outcomes in this community, and then preserve, resources, hospital resources as a whole. And so, as Chris mentioned, we did a lot with working with providing education in our shelters, and PPE, appropriate PPE, guidance on physical distancing, masks, and as well as set up those resources to try to decrease crowding in shelters. And then we've actually also worked together to implement testing programs. So we have data coming out of the CDC telling us that our rates, that in some shelters, for instance, the rates are 25–50% of people in some shelters are impacted. And so we had to, again, act really quickly with our public health partners, DDPHE and Denver Public Health, to start testing people, both asymptomatic and symptomatic, because we know that is important because of the number of asymptomatic infections, to really pull people that are infectious out of congregate settings, put them in a safe isolation setting, and be able to monitor them. And then we've also done a lot of screening for those high-risk conditions that I mentioned, to try to take people that are camping and people that are in shelters, and give them a safe place so that they don't contract COVID.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stella. Dr. Rowan, if I can ask you, knowing everything that Dr. Stella just told us, what do you see the safe outdoor space doing to try and help sort of fill the gap and fill the need within our community when looking at COVID and really the medical crisis that we're in?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you. So I'm an infectious disease doctor, and my team organizes basically COVID testing in disproportionately impacted neighborhoods as well as shelters. And then we went to 3 different encampments and did testing as well. And I think, to your question, what we found was that, I think people need options. And we tested in shelters. We found significantly higher rates of active COVID and past COVID, so antibody positivity, and also PCR in people staying in shelters. And the rates have varied, and the shelters are doing an amazing job at trying to really decrease risk for the people that are staying there. But we certainly did see a significant difference in terms of risk for COVID among the shelters, among the encampments that we went to. That being said, there are a lot of things that people are at risk for in terms of infections in the community. So we're seeing outbreaks of Shigella, which is a bacterial infection that can cause very serious diarrhea that leads people to be hospitalized. We're seeing an increase in Bartonella quintana, which can cause a heart infection and can cause death. And then hepatitis A has been in our community for a couple of years now. So, I think the more that we can provide a safe, clean, spaced option for people, the better off we are. And if that is indoors for some people because that's what they choose, then that's great. And I'm so thankful to all of the modifications that have been made to our shelter system. And for others, I think we need to support them and meet them where they're at to really decrease the risk of these outbreaks in our community. And I would be happy to answer any questions. I didn't prepare anything else for today.
No, that's wonderful. We really appreciate it. And now I would like to introduce Nicole Martinez. As I said, she is from Las Cruces, New Mexico, and she has a very successful trauma-informed housing first model that has allowed us to really build our emergency SOS model off of the framework that she has created. So Nicole, I will give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I really appreciate Kwika's presentation, as I did see a lot of similarities. I know how much work it is in organizing a camp like this. So I wanted to give a little bit of information on the camp that we have been operating, and hopefully just help to support the SOS camp. So I'm here in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and I work at the Mesilla Valley Community of Hope. And we have been in operation since the late 1990s, and we have several different types of programs. We originally started as a homeless outreach center, so we provide day shelter services, showers, laundry, things like that. And in about 2005, we decided to start housing people as the actual form of ending homelessness. So we aggressively started getting housing funding, but as many communities quickly learn, there are not enough affordable housing units. Housing vouchers can be very scarce. And we had a lot of people who were still sleeping outside. So a lot of people that are camping anyway. And so we wanted to make sure that we were addressing how to help people who were sleeping outside that were not able to go either into a unit quickly or to the overnight indoor shelter. And so we started to meet with the residents who were experiencing homelessness at the time. And some of the future residents of Camp Hope said, you know, what if we start a tent city? And so we thought that that sounded like a good temporary option in the beginning and pilot project. And so we named it Camp Hope. We went to our city council and asked for permission to start a camp behind the Mesilla Valley Community of Hope. And in that way, it would have the infrastructure that was needed to operate a camp, be close to services, and we would be able to address other healthcare needs, food needs, because on our campus of agencies, we also have other supportive services providers right here on site. While it was a gamble for us, you know, there wasn't a pandemic happening. This was just sort of something that we wanted to address in our community. And so, you know, we felt the benefit would hopefully be worth the risk, and it proved to be. We very quickly saw that we were able to serve a lot more people with shelter and with streamlined services. So, you know, we were able to get people into their appointments for housing, go do inspections for their units, take them over to access healthcare, get a food box, whatever it is that they would need so quickly. We were housing people at an astonishing rate just because they were right in our backyard, literally. We had been meeting with the residents on the design of the camp, the implementation of it, and the rules. So we felt like that was really important to get their voices. As part of a trauma-informed care model, we decided that we wanted to make it a low barrier camp. We recognize our audience, you know, who we're serving, and we wanted to be very mindful of that. And we continue to this day to meet weekly with the residents of Camp Hope, making sure that we are all on the same page, that we understand the challenges of being in the camp, that they feel like they are heard by our agency who oversees the camp, and that we also just help to empower them and be very transparent, especially while we have a pandemic going on. So we do have rules at Camp Hope. And again, we did use some input from the residents who are there, and then we also utilized input, of course, from staff to operate that. Again, we already had people who were camping on our property in other areas. And so we looked at, you know, what is our alternative? We weren't really interested at the time in developing a brick and mortar shelter. We already had one of those. We really wanted to continue to aggressively house people as our end to homelessness. And so by operating Camp Hope, we found that it was very cost effective for us to do that. We did it for 3 months. We took the data to our city council and said, we still don't have another alternative. This is really working. We would like to continue doing this. And they said that we could do that. So we rezoned our property. We had to meet 16 conditions, which we have met in order to redesignate this property to allow camping on the property. We do have staff. Our camp is a little bit different than the SOS model, but each community needs to tailor you know, what their resources are and what will work for their community. We, again, you know, think it's really important that we continue to focus on serving people while they are on the streets, and develop the services and the plan to help them end their homelessness and address their issues while they are on the streets and as they transition into housing. This model does work. It's not without its challenges, but if you are able to sanction a camp and organize how people are sleeping outside in a way that includes their voice in that, then you can have a model that does work in your community. And I will, of course, be online for any questions.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Before I pass it to Reverend Peters, I just, Denver is an exponentially expensive place to live. The Out of Reach study that was published this year shows that we need to make $19 an hour to afford a one-bedroom apartment here in Denver, Colorado. And that is well above our minimum wage. So before we had COVID, as Chris said, we already had a place that was very difficult to find housing. With COVID, we saw a pretty significant loss of minimum wage jobs. And we've seen a pretty significant increase in evictions. Not everybody is covered by the current eviction moratorium that is nationally put in place. And we are going to continue to see people when that moratorium lifts who are unable to pay their back rent. So we're going to continue to see an increase in homelessness. So this is a solution, again, where we can bring people into one area, where we can actually reach them. We can bring in the resources. As Nicole said, the outreach workers can come, they're right there, and be able to truly make those connections for how we create a more sustainable living and a more sustainable future for those who are currently unhoused in Denver. So I'd like to introduce Reverend Peters. And Reverend, if you can just talk about what you're seeing in your own community, first and foremost, and then I welcome you to talk a little bit about the invitation for the community of Denver.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it's been really great to hear and learn so much already. My name is Reverend Jasper Peters. I serve the people of Denver with Belong Church. We are located at 1615 Ogden, about a block north of the Ogden Theater, where we've been for about 4 years. Before that, for 100 odd years, that property was known as St. Paul's United Methodist Church, and we were grateful to inherit it in a sense. And in this moment, it's interesting the way that you phrase the question, what I'm seeing in my community. And the reality is that since March, the way that we all perceive and experience community has totally transformed. And whereas I used to be able to rely on seeing the people in my community a couple times a week and allowing the opportunity to check in on their well-being and all of those things, that has been totally upended. But the surprise blessing for us, especially as this conversation began to emerge, was the realization that we have this amazing resource that we cannot use right now. There are people parking in our parking lot, and as we're setting this up, we're asking for patience and rearranging plans and expectations with people who are parking there. But beyond that, we're not in a place where we can do the work that we want to do in the world, right? That we want to be, to represent grace and mercy and love. We don't have the opportunity to do that in the way that we are used to doing it. And so instead, this presents as an amazing opportunity to do that because our community has asked for it. And when I say community in that moment, I don't mean the specific people who attend and worship with us, but recognizing something that we try really hard to understand and reiterate and to embed in our culture is this understanding that y'all are our community and we are yours, and we're all in this together. And the things, independent of whether you worship with us or whether you're our faith tradition or not, a deep recognition that if we can't find a way to care well for one another, then I personally, and we as an institution, don't deserve the trust and respect that people often so freely offer to churches and religious institutions. If we can't hear the question, hear the statement move along and not ask the question to where, and be willing to stick around for the really difficult process of answering that question, but in this case, the years-long process of answering that question, then we can't understand ourselves as being actually faithful to our ethos and to our overall commitments. And so I'm happy to answer any specific questions y'all have about the church, but the thing that I want to share, please don't misunderstand me. I love my community. I love it from head to toe. But in this moment, I would like to instill in you a sense of our utter ordinariness, Whereas in this moment, we might appear to be unique, or we might be lifted up as an example, and that's great, and we're happy to serve as that. But really what we want to be is a possibility model, because I'll be honest, this has been shockingly simple. Even this process beginning has been so much simpler. There's been so much more support and thought and structure than I could have imagined when we first said yes. So as someone who has been charged to care for a little parcel of land right in the middle of Uptown, we're giving what we have. We're giving the square footage that we have. We're giving the resources that we have. We're giving the energy that we have. I say that we're ordinary so that I'm hoping someone else who's ordinary can hear this and understand that it doesn't actually require some superhuman set of abilities or circumstances in order to actually say yes to this and actually offer something. Goodness, think about it for a quick second about how meaningful and deeply impactful this is. This chance that we're giving people for whom the world has turned everything upside down, even giving a chance or a glimmer at a sense of stability and as a stepping stone to the other things that so many of us take for granted. So I say all that to say, if you don't remember me, you don't remember the name of my church, don't remember, fine. But please, I feel it in my heart that there are people on this call who can give another thought to whether they are the person who might be able to assist in some way, shape, or form. Or perhaps you know someone who has a parking lot, who has an open space, who has something that they could offer up in this space as well. So I'm truly grateful just to be invited to the party with so many prolific thinkers and amazing folks who continue to give back to our community, and in whatever way that we can be both that possibility model and a support and that really friendly voice that says, come on in, the water's fine. To whatever degree we can be any or all of those things, we're grateful for that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Reverend. And so this weekend on Saturday and Sunday, the Reverend has opened up his parking lot for the Safe Outdoor Space Collaborative and the Colorado Village Collaborative to set up a SOS mock site. No one will be sleeping there, but we are inviting the Denver community to please come over and see what it is going to look like to have a uniform site. A lot of the concerns we've been having is that people walk down the street and they see a lot of clutter or scatter, and we really want to be able to show you a different image, to show you what we know we can produce in a healthy, resource-rich environment for those who are unhoused. So I will have Hannah throw the Belong Church address, just ping her, into the chat box if you would. Thank you. And we invite anybody who'd like to come. Tell your friends in Denver. You know, we would really love to answer more of your questions. We'd really love for you to come and see what we're providing, see the list of providers who have already signed on to come and really assist those who need help. And our goal, of course, is to provide those resources and to make those connections so that we can get individuals and couples off the street and into a sustainable housing solution. So if you have questions, I would love for you to put them in our chat box. And I'm going to actually turn it over to Hannah. I think we have a few already, and then we can go to some that came in from email.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I'm hearing some mixed things about the chat. Some people do have access to it, but I don't think everybody does. But so I will go with some of the questions that I have. And then I'm not sure how we want to, I have some people with their hands raised. Kathleen, do we want to unmute those people at that point and hear their questions, or?
Sure, yeah, it looks like, at least on my end, we have 3 questions that came in. Is that about right? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I think we'll answer those 3 and then we can absolutely just go ahead and give people the floor.
Yeah, so the first question was, will this be recorded? And I did answer in the chat that it will be recorded afterwards, and we'll provide some info on that as well. Will it be on our website after, I believe? Okay, yeah. So the other question is, how are you ensuring houseless people have access to clean air per Governor Polis's recommendation that residents remain indoors during low air quality notices?
Sure. So I'm probably going to pass this over to one of our doctors. You know, we have a multitude of things that are kind of colliding here in 2020. And unfortunately, the fires and the air are just adding to one more complication that we do have to address. So we are, going to be doing our best to provide certain types of masks to individuals who are inside. We had an organization reach out today actually discussing that with us. But I'd love to ask Dr. Seller or Dr. Rowan what you guys think about that as well. And if you have any suggestions on things that those who are unhoused could do, since we do right now have fairly low and poor air quality.
I think that's a really, I don't have I wish I had a better answer for that. I don't have that. I think that's something that, needs to be continued to be discussed and talked about. I think, but I don't have a solution, unfortunately, for that. And as you mentioned, it's a whole bunch of things colliding at once. But I'm hopeful that the same collaboration that has allowed us to do the work that we have done and make progress in this community, as Chris mentioned, that same collaboration is going to be needed to address many other health concerns in our unhoused neighbors. And I think we as physicians have very significant concerns, regarding the health of this very vulnerable community. And I think it's going to take a lot of collaboration and a lot of hard work to address these issues in the long term. But I'm optimistic based on the level of collaboration that I've seen from this community so far.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to jump in and add that I think that, this is a harm reduction model, and so it will not be all things to all people. And I'm not an expert in this model, but I do know that looking at the cold weather that's coming, people will be making hard choices. Do they move inside? Do they increase density in indoor shelters? They're really going to have to weigh risks of COVID in communal settings versus the risk of the cold. And in some ways, I see this as a personal decision in which we're giving people the tools and the options to make the decision for themselves.
Thank you so much. Hannah, do we have another question?
Yeah, thank you guys. The next question is, how are you supporting and working with community groups who are providing hand washing stations, porta potties, food, water, and other resources to houseless encampments around the city?
Sure. Kwika, do you want to talk about our partnership with some of the organizations that are currently doing that, like D-Hole?
Yeah, absolutely. We have been working with Denver Homeless Out Loud, making sure that their input and their ear to the ground has been a part of this process. And we plan on having that continued involvement with folks who are advocating for people without voices. As far as, supporting folks that are currently doing the work with food, we do have a network of faith communities that have volunteered to provide hot meals for us on a daily basis. And, we continue to expand our partnerships. We have a lot of people that have, so willingly offered up whatever they can do to help make this model successful. And we will continue to support any interest in community involvement from community partnerships.
Thank you, Kwika. Yeah, it's very important. We spurred from a collaboration. So of providers really coming together and seeing a gap and seeing an emergency and a public health crisis, and really saying, what resources do we have? and how do we work together. And I can say I've been grateful for that, because we do have, even on this call, even on your panel, we have a multitude of people who are doing, little bits to make this better, to make this a little bit easier when it is a horrific public health crisis. So we are, so grateful for collaboration for food and hand washing and bathrooms, as well as the fact that there are organizations who've been out providing that throughout the last 6 months as well. So, Hannah, do we have another one?
Yeah.
One more?
Yeah, thanks. I don't know how many more we can take. We do have a few more. And we have some people with their hands raised as well. So the next one is, how are you taking extra steps to ensure validation and well-being of LGBTQ houseless people?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that there are some groups of folks that are disproportionately represented in the current unsheltered population. So we see Native Americans, Black folks, Latinx folks, LGBTQIA folks. Excuse me. Oh my goodness, I've talked too much today. But we want to represent the actual representation of what we see in the unsheltered folks. So we definitely are making this a very welcoming space. We don't allow any oppressive or discriminatory behavior, and we want to offer it to folks who are disproportionately represented. So we want to make sure that we're seeing the same representation in the SOS as in the current unsheltered population. And, with our current shelter system, it's gender-based, men and women, and there is a small shelter that does some LGBTQA sheltering. And so we know that folks are not accessing shelter due to those reasons. So we want to make sure that this space is open to meet those folks where they're at.
One of the other benefits of this SOS as well is that we are going to be able to provide a safe 24-hour secure area for many who are in marginalized populations, who don't feel safe going into shelters, who have had trauma in shelters or trauma in their life. We will be able to have trauma-informed 24-hour staff in a place where they have their own area. So it's really set up so that people who have been marginalized, who don't feel safe with the other options, do have an option, especially during COVID.
Thank you, Kathleen. So the next question is for Nicole. And the question is, did you see a rush on services from people around the region once you were up and running? And that's from Mason.
It's a great question, and it's one that I get asked a lot. And especially, in the beginning, it was that question of, if you build it, they will come. And we got that, from our city staff as well as surrounding businesses. And we pondered that question ourselves. So I think it's definitely valid. We did not see a rush. What I will say is that we saw people who we were already serving asking for this to be implemented. It wasn't that we had a lot of people experiencing homelessness throughout the nation Googling our Camp Hope hotspot. And I can say, after the first few years that we ran the program, our numbers of people that we were serving actually went down. And again, I attribute that to us being able to quickly house people. So we were getting people into Camp Hope, and then we were immediately housing people, and we had less people then in our community that were accessing Camp Hope and our other services. It's been a little different this year because of COVID. We are taking more people. So we also, like your model is showing, we can take up to 50 people. After running it, we don't have 24-hour staff. The camp is pretty autonomous in that way, and it's been designed that way for our purposes. And so we've just found that utilizing it that way, we're making sure that people feel as safe as they can. And so we've increased the amount of people that we are taking at the camp in that sort of outside air kind of shelter space. We also had our local shelter go into lockdown, and so that did add more people needing to access services at Camp Hope. So we know that we'll have a lot higher numbers this year, people that we are serving, but typically we didn't. We just saw, you could say we saw a rush on services from people that we were, again, already serving, but not necessarily from other places. And, you know, everybody has capacity. So you serve the 50 that you can, and then you work on serving the others and seeing how quickly you can transition and work with your partners for housing and other resources. And you might, you know, access other shelter options as you've discussed as the weather gets colder. But for us, you know, I know I see one of the other questions will be for your group to answer about who is entering the site. And that was a question that we would get asked a lot. In the beginning, we did have a waiting list. And then again, our numbers became a lot fewer. And so then ours now is on a first come, first serve basis. But it'll be interesting to hear how your model is set up.
Sure, Kwika, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are going to be working with Denver Street Outreach Collaborative for the folks that are interested in the site. We also have bounced other ideas off. So our last site that we started pursuing, we were looking for going where people are naturally camping and trying to set up an SOS there, and then inviting the folks that are currently camping illegally into the SOS site. So we have a couple different options depending on where we go, but we also will have a wait list for folks. You know, our hopes are to stand up to 3 of these sites. So we want to make sure we have that running referral list going as well.
And I just want to note real quick, Hannah, there are other areas, like I mentioned at the beginning, in Colorado that have opened SOS sites or are currently or have had something like an SOS in place and they're expanding upon. And other than the normal increase from eviction and loss of job, they have not seen a flooding of individuals come into those locations because they're offering services. So it's a great question. It's one that I had as well when we started looking at the model. But it is a good thing to know that usually people understand the capacity and it doesn't cause sort of a cluster around where the SOSs are being set up.
Yeah, we have some folks that have some raised hands, so I'm going to go ahead and invite them to ask their question. Rebecca, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes. Thank you all for your work that you're doing on behalf of the unsheltered. My question is for Chris. I'm wondering why the city doesn't offer its public space in designating an SOS site. I have worked with DHOL and ASAP with Interfaith Alliance. I volunteer, excuse me, with Women's Homeless Initiative. And so for about the last 8 years, I have been concerned about this issue. And I know San Francisco opened up their first SOS right next to the Asian Art Museum in the public library. And so COVID has been around for 6 months. And Hancock announced in July that he would have an SOS. And now it is almost the 1st of October. And so that's one question. And then the second part of that is anticipating the second or third wave of COVID. I think the issue that I always hear from my friends that aren't familiar with the unsheltered is they are disgusted because of the trash or disgusted because of waste on their personal waste on their private property. And so DHOL, it's been mentioned tonight, has funded some porta potties, but my question is, why isn't the city, because of public health and safety, why isn't the city funding more hand washing stations and public potties? COVID really pointed out that once everything shut down, libraries and restaurants, there was no place.
Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate those questions. I'll take them one, and if I'm not hitting the point, feel free to let me know. The identification of a site to place an SOS has been the larger barrier to moving the program vision forward, and we didn't anticipate necessarily that it would. City of Denver has been working very closely with Colorado Village Collaborative, meeting several times a week on this issue to try to vet through potentialities, and many of those potentials are public space and city identified sites. I think CVC could answer just as well as I can that some of the sites that get identified in technical review get quickly removed, and some of the sites that are identified, what we've found is increasingly the opposition from the neighborhood and neighborhood fears remove them from the table, which is part of the reason we're here tonight, to try to reframe and help provide as much information as possible as we can about the program, so people understand that before we're talking about individual sites. On the other topic, I believe it was installation of public health resources, and there have been installations of public health resources through parks, through DDPHE, public health environment. They maintain a map resource of where hand washing locations are. We'll always encourage and have those resources in the facility-based programs that we provide that are both shelter as well as day shelter or drop-in centers as well. You're right that many of the civic infrastructures that people experiencing homelessness access, such as the library and others that aren't just directly affiliated with serving people in homelessness, are not accessible and are closed. And so Parks, for instance, has installed additional portables outside in Civic Center Park, outside of the library. Where we find ourselves stifled a bit is that we can't bring all those services to each individual organic encampment that pops up. They're too numerous. For one, we don't have the resource, and it's not outside the law, and we hear about it vehemently. It's a bad representation of sometimes of how we need to proceed through these issues, but mainly it's like we can't show up on every block with that infrastructure. So we're doing as best we can. I think one of the things that Safe Outdoor Space does is we can provide, or we can assist organizing that kind of infrastructure around clearly identified and programmatic sites that have their boundaries, right? We know this is a 50-person site that we want to support. We can get city departments involved on a meeting a couple times a week to figure out how to support those resources going into it, how to support those being sustained as part of the program vision. But when it's kind of growing organically everywhere we go across the city, it becomes a different thing for us.
Thanks, Chris. So there is another question in the chat that I got, and it says, do you see this temporary option as a temporary option during COVID, or will this be a service that continues past the pandemic? If so, how do you see it transforming into a more permanent model? And I didn't know if you, Kathleen or Kwika, wanted to touch on, I've gotten a lot of chat comments about families and just like what our model is going to be like for single people and couples.
Sure. I will start, and Kwika, you can tell me if I am missing things and chime in as well. First and foremost, I will address, we are seeing a lot ourselves of families, a lot of families parking as well. We're seeing a lot of women who are on the street. Domestic violence increased significantly during COVID. And it is just, it's created just a detrimental result for women who need a safe place to be. Our current shelter model is not taking in families. We have organizations that we partner with. We have organizations that we work with, that Chris knows, that Chris works with. The goal with families is not to have them in that shelter setting, is not to have them in a safe outdoor space. It is to have them as rapidly rehoused as possible. As much as we love to do that with absolutely everyone, and it is not necessarily safe for anybody to sleep on the street for again, a multitude of reasons, from freezing cold weather to potential violence, for any other thing. But the city of Denver has done a phenomenal job at trying to make sure we do not have children on the street. Denver Homeless Out Loud does an amazing job at knowing who is on the street and really being able to communicate that with the other partners. So we know that there is that increase. That discussion is continuing to happen on what we do with that, what we do with safe parking. Again, as Chris said, it's horrific, and we're seeing it across the nation. It's something I talked about on national calls today as well. And I'll really quickly throw that back at you, Chris, in case there's something I'm missing with the families, and then Quika, I'll send it to you for a little bit more about who we're accepting.
No, thank you. Yeah, family homelessness in the region, not just city of Denver, for years was the fastest growing demographic of homelessness. And as we anticipate economic drivers, job loss and such, that's gonna meet our families at some point. It might not meet immediately, but within a series of months, when those organic relationships wear themselves out, they'll be approaching our system. It's a terrible thing. Our goal when we see a family in homelessness is to provide them their own four walls together with their own bathroom in a motel. It's not necessarily congregate shelter model. It's also not necessarily a safe outdoor space model, but we do try to sustain families within motel stays, and as Kathleen mentioned, assist them with housing as quickly as possible. The other part of your question about the duration or the vision for this, as far as the city is concerned, it's been made pretty clear that this is a harm reduction effort that's driven from a public health perspective, right? So right now, where the city stands on it is the duration of the program would be for the duration of the public health emergency as harm reduction. I want to be really clear about what we mean about harm reduction, though, because it's often understood or misinterpreted that a safe outdoor space would only pop up to reduce harm and people will languish there to keep them safe, but it doesn't extend beyond that. And certainly the primary objective of the safe outdoor space is keeping people safe during the pandemic from COVID. But that doesn't mean there's not a trajectory, right? And the trajectory of safe outdoor space is always going to point indoors, right? We want people to move from the street into indoors. And that's going to be a variety of different things that we'll be prepared to respond to. If somebody's wanting shelter, if somebody's wanting a motel option that they're eligible for, we'll be able to create that pipeline from the safe outdoor space. And yes, if somebody is needing housing, and we have the housing resource that's that fit, knowing where they are, knowing that they're affiliated with the Safe Outdoor Space program is definitely that game changer, and being able to coordinate all the wherewithal that it takes to move people into that housing opportunity. We will have $4 million of rehousing assistance moving through the community as part of our COVID response, right? So this isn't the motels, this isn't the shelter, this is identifying people to the actual housing, the apartment key, right? Having that safe outdoor space is going to help us within that COVID pandemic time be able to identify some of that resource to people who are directly experiencing homelessness on the street. So people don't enter the SOS just to be protected from COVID, but they also enter that SOS to be able to meet people like Quika, to be able to meet an outreach worker, to be able to have those resources returned to them in a meaningful way.
And I also wanted to just address the temporary nature of the SOS. It is, as Chris said, tied to the public health crisis and orders. And we also have a 21-day wind down period. So if those orders change, we have it set up that we start winding down, where we have Kathleen working some amazing fundraising to try to extend, based on where the folks are at inside the camp. We don't want to just kick them out and put them back on sleeping on the streets. We hope to provide an additional extended support system. I'd also like to have another raised hand question. Rachel, go ahead. We have you ready.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I'm one of the ones that doesn't have access to the chat. I have a basically like a double-pronged question, but first I want to give a shout out to Reverend Jasper for just all the positive language, like possibility model with Belong Church, because I think that's really key. What are the possibilities rather than what are the dangers? I'm from Colorado, most recently was in Denver. I'm not there now. I'm in Arizona. And just so that you understand the context of my questions, I'm coming from both working for about 17 years in the nonprofit sector in homeless services and food security to becoming homeless myself for 4.5 years, and it started in Denver. So it's just kind of personal to me, or incredibly personal to me. But I'm not going to go on an elongated narrative there. My questions have to do with some of the other possibility models that could and should exist that are being achieved in other parts of our world. In terms of addressing homelessness and in terms of addressing all the old school regulations that have to do with everything from social stigma to actual building and developing housing for folks, because a housing first model is really the only model that's ever going to end homelessness. So I'm questioning two specific things that have or have not been considered in Denver. And one of them is co-living buildings. Think of like a WeWork or some of the co-working spaces around Denver. And I mean, beyond like Colorado Village Collaborative and Beloved Community Village, the actual large structures, repurposing, retrofitting existing even office buildings that aren't complete or have been abandoned as everyone's working remotely, and doing something with that property that's already there and bypassing all the need for plumbing and everything else that happens at the tiny home villages. And so that's my first question. And then my other question is, how has the city of Denver helped people in homeless communities get on transit or transport themselves on mobility, a variety of mobility during the pandemic and moving forward? Because prior to COVID-19, there wasn't, in my personal opinion, any kind of real help for people experiencing homelessness, getting from point A to point B. And as all of you know, a lot of folks still work, still have school, still have medical appointments, even if they don't have a home. And so I'm just wondering if anything around public transit or rideshare programs, partnering with Lyft, Uber, etc., was anything that came up beyond like moving everybody out of the city into all these different other places where there's space for them just to kind of get rid of them, and how would they even get there to begin with? Thank you.
Thank you. I will answer your first question on sort of refurb housing and workforce. And there's a couple things going on. First and foremost, I work with the Congregation Lane Campaign. So aside from doing the homelessness, I am also doing housing, which does look at, refurbishing motels, apartments, utilizing congregation land, nonprofit land, city land, to build or refurbish a multitude of different types of living situations, from transitional housing to workforce housing, group living. The other thing you mentioned, of course, was, and you seem to know this well, Denver is fighting a pretty systemic problem with policy around housing, stemming even well before redlining within our city. And one of those policies, aside from, zoning codes and things of that nature, is a group living code. And That group living code is currently something that we would encourage, the Interfaith Alliance would encourage the citizens within Denver to look into. It is something that is going in front of City Council. It is something that right now a limited number of adults can live in the same residence together. It would expand the number of people who can live together. It would expand the number of people who a shelter can serve. The benefits of that is instant affordable housing, instant ability for us to find living spaces for individuals. So we are looking into that outside of the SOS through our organization. And then obviously the Colorado Village Collaborative is very committed to continuing to build tiny homes around Colorado. As far as city transportation, I'm gonna have to kick that back to you, Chris.
Sure, and I appreciate your comments about group living. As someone whose majority of my time living in Denver has been spent living illegally in a group living environment, it makes sense for this time to change some of the rules that hamstring us. On transportation, in Denver, the public transit system is a regional system. So City of Denver government, it's not an issue of a directive that would grow from City of Denver, but would be a partnership that we would need to build with the regional governance of Regional Transportation District, RTD, who runs our buses and light rail lines. At the beginning of the pandemic, they actually did stop collecting fares, and that was extraordinarily facilitative of our ability to stand up National Western and Denver Coliseum that are just far enough on the outskirts of town to prevent people from accessing the space by foot. So people were able to board the buses, board a straight line from central Denver to those resources operating 24 hours a day. That decision, it wasn't a homelessness decision so much as it was a spacing decision to make sure the drivers were protected. They didn't want to collect and transact fare money when they didn't know the implications that had for COVID spread. That's ended, but that's ended as a decision by RTD's part, but was extraordinarily facilitative at the time. How we handle transportation for shelter access is actually a private company, charter company. It's outside of that RTD system. We work with Aero Stage Lines to assist people when needed to get to our larger shelters from staging areas downtown. And also a number of our providers roll up their sleeves and put gas in the tank of their vans and such to assist with that as well. But largely, you know, we, City of Denver, would need to strike that agreement or partnership with RTD to find innovative ways to better serve the ridership needs of people in homelessness who need that most, right? So, but that's kind of where things work. You know, if it was a directive that we could make, we'd be much more able to kind of just decide on protocols for how to support people in a better way. But we do what we can with the partners that we have, including charter buses, our partner providers, and RTD often.
Thank you. So we're getting really close to the end of our time together. So what I'd like to do is, if you have entered something into the chat, if you could talk privately with Hannah and let her know how we can reach you, I'd be happy to answer your questions. If you're still raising your hand, on our flyer for tonight was actually an email address where you could have sent questions beforehand. If you send questions there, we will be happy to answer those. I'll work with this panel if you had a question for someone other than myself. And the other option is I'd love to have as many of you as you can come out on Saturday and Sunday and really see the SOS setup so that you can see what it's like. You can meet Kwika, you can meet some of us, we can answer any questions you have moving forward, or if anything pops up tonight. I would like to leave you with just a couple thoughts. So as we face unprecedented times, we really need to prioritize the urgency for service. It's the difference between life and death, especially as we move into winter. A uniformed, resource-rich, housing-first site allows for our community to truly help support those who are less fortunate. So during this pandemic, going again into these freezing winter seasons, we must start to think humanely and with dignity for our neighbors. We must shift our concern from physical beauty to the concern of our fellow citizen. We know that the homeless population has grown since COVID. We know that the homeless population is probably going to continue to grow. We must take action to provide stability and transitional support for those in need. Simply ignoring this issue is only going to increase the need and the risk to the community really at large. During a worldwide pandemic, one must consider the impact not only on ourselves, but on those around us who were not as fortunate as us to remain housed and employed throughout this pandemic. I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight, as well as our panelists, and for being open about your support, your concerns, and your questions. We really do hope that we can move forward as a community in solving many issues that this global pandemic has presented. And we do hope you have a wonderful evening, and everybody will come out and take the opportunity to see what the SOS looks like on Saturday and Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.